Hi, everyone. So, we're continuing the conversation we were having on Wednesday about collective action problems. And if you remember where we left off last time, we were talking about how do you solve collective action problems. I'll let you review what those collective action problems are yourself. If you need to remind yourself what public goods are, externalities, free rider problem, go review that. Where we left off, we talked about two solutions already. We talked about the third party coercion, where like a third party, like the government, maybe steps in and taxes and then pays for the public goods provision. So that sort of forces people to contribute who might not otherwise contribute. The second solution is to change the incentives of the participants. And that was things like the byproduct theory and political entrepreneurs and things like that. Now, something about both these two solutions I didn't mention the other day is that both of these first two solutions require some external actor, whoever that is, whether it's a government or somebody else, an NGO, who knows, to do something. It's not me, the person who might be the free rider, who's doing it. Somebody else is investing in trying to get me, the free rider, to do something. So this begs the question, why would that external actor, whatever it is, contribute the costs of changing those incentives? And this actually turns out to be another collective action problem. So sometimes there's collective action problems and collective action problems and collective action problems. So if you're going to say, for example, governments should get people to do this, then you have to ask the question, why would the government do this? So solution number 3, but that doesn't make the other two solutions bad. It just means that there's other questions that are asked that you don't ask with, say, this one. And this one is, solution number 3 is voluntary community consent of rules and or public good provision, which is a fancy way of saying if the roommates have a problem, the roommates get together and figure out a solution that works for them and actually solves the problem. Let me just give you a quick example before we get going. One problem that roommates always face is a messy house. There's just like the public good here is clean house, and man, roommates around the world can't have trouble solving this thing. And one of sort of the universal solutions. First of all, think about how your roommates, when you've lived with roommates, has solved this problem. We talked the other day about like the super neat freak roommate who does all the work. But in this case, what is often the solution is this thing called the chore chart. And the chore chart is this thing that the roommates come up with. It's not like handed down from them from Jesus on 10 Commandments. It's a thing that they come up with together and they put on the fridge, and essentially it says, I'm in charge of cleaning the bathroom this week, you're in charge of cleaning the kitchen this week, you're in charge of cleaning this week, and then next week we'll switch, and there you go. How does the chore chart work? The chore chart is just this voluntary community consent. We all voluntary, so community, we all voluntarily consent to coming up with this system. If anybody disagrees with the system, it's not going to work. A chore chart in a house where the roommate, one or more of the roommates say, I'm not going to do that, it just is not an effective system. They all have to sort of do this. So you just watched that video on Tragedy of the Commons, or some of you already know about the Tragedy of the Commons, so it was a little bit of a review there. But I just want to talk through that and how this sort of works. The Tragedy of the Commons, the problem is if you don't have a government, there's a government, the government can step in and protect the commons, like with national parks and things like that. But where you don't have a government, you have this problem. And the way it's often solved, let me just give you the traditional way it's solved is this thing called privatization, where you take the land, for example, let's say this is our commons here, and we all share it, and it gets overused. So the classical solution is you divide up the commons like this, and everybody gets a chunk. And then if you put too many cows on your chunk, it will eat up all the grass, and your chunk will die, and then you'll be the one in trouble while everybody else is okay. So that gives every individual the incentive to protect their particular spot of it. That is a great solution in some cases. So for example, in the cow case, yeah, okay, that might work. There's a couple downsides to it though. First of all, some commons that we talk about can't be divided. Like for example, a fishery. If I did this with a fishery, if I fish all the fish out of my area here, more fish from your area just swim right in. If we're talking about, say, the atmosphere, the U.S. will just be responsible for the greenhouse gases in its area. Well, other greenhouse gases are going to drift over from Canada. So you just can't divide up all commons. The other problem is that the rich often get richer. So let's take our commons here, and let's imagine that there's a river that kind of runs through it like that, okay? Obviously, the parts of the commons that have the river are way better than the parts that don't have the commons. So if we're going to divide this up and privatize it, everybody gets a chunk of land. Who gets this chunk right there? With the water and the easy access, to the village right over here, who gets that one? Well, how do you make those decisions? And often what's going to happen is those who have the power are going to be the ones who get to set the system up, and they're going to take this section. And those who don't have the power end up with this section over here. And essentially, this one, I can maintain that for a long time. This one's a lot harder. It's often seen as an unjust solution. So, the other way we sort of talk about this then, the way I want you to be thinking about this a little bit here is community monitoring and credible punishment. What all chore charts have are this: community monitoring and credible punishment. So let's talk about the chore chart for a second. Here's my chore chart. I don't know why I'm drawing a chore chart. It looks like our privatization comments. Ugh. All right, so the point about the chore chart is if I'm in charge of the bathroom this week, here's the thing. If we all say, we're all going to clean the house today, fantastic. Or we're all going to keep the house clean and nobody has assigned things. Well, if the bathroom doesn't get cleaned, that's because all of us didn't do it. So who's responsible? No one's responsible. But the chore chart says, I'm in charge of the bathroom. And so if the bathroom isn't clean, it's very clear who didn't do their work. We call this monitoring. It's one of the reasons why, like when we do group projects, what often happens is, rather than just say, we'll all just get it done, one of the first things that almost always happens with a group project is somebody says, okay, I'm going to be in charge of this section, you're going to be in charge of this section, you're going to be in charge of this section. And the reason why is because if that section doesn't get done, you know whose fault it was, which means you can't sort of cheat and get away with it. So community monitoring, I know that I know who is cheating. 2, there's some punishment that if you don't do your job on the chore chart, some sort of punishment that the group can inflict on each other. Inflict is not the right word, but place on each other. That's the thing that happens. And so, for example, maybe you have to do 2 jobs next week, or maybe you have to put $5 into a jar, or $20 into a jar, or something like that. And it has to be credible. In other words, what if the punishment was, if you don't clean the bathroom this week, we chop off your hand? Well, here's the honest truth. That's very severe punishment, right? That's definitely going to get me to clean the bathroom if I really think you're going to chop my hand off. But I don't think you're going to chop my hand off, so it's not really that credible. So I'm not that worried about it. It doesn't really get me to do the work. So punishment, it has to be costly enough that I would rather provide the public good than not, but not so costly, credible, that I don't think it's actually going to be applied. All these things, so you have to have credible community monitoring, credible punishment, and all these things are enhanced. It actually makes it easier to do that if we have a couple things. So for example, if I have a smaller group size, if I have a group project where there's 5 of us working on it instead of, if there's 35 of us working on it, man, that's a really hard thing to do. The smaller the group, the easier. It's why often at the global level, rather than say, let's solve all human trafficking, 3 or 4 countries will get together and try and solve human trafficking between them, and then see if you can expand it from there. Extensive interaction over time, over several issues. Roommates that are friends in other contexts, like they hang out together and things like that, they actually can do this a lot better, the chore chart a lot better, because if you don't clean the bathroom, you're not just a jerky roommate, you're a jerky friend, you're a jerk, all these other things, and there's other ways to sort of inflict is not the right word, but apply punishment to one another. And I guess, again, when we're talking about at the global level, states interact with each other all the time over a lot of different issues. So that's actually going to enhance our ability to get this solution at the global level. Mutual monitoring, there has to be the ability to know who cheats. And who is the person that is checking this? It tends to be each other. When that's a problem, you might also hire somebody to watch. I know that's not going to work in the chore chart situation, but for example, at the global level, we're all going to watch each other. The WTO, so think about free trade. Every state is going to watch every other state and make sure they're not violating free trade. That's fine. But what's even easier is sort of create this institution called the World Trade Organization, and it will then do that watching for all of us. Personal commitments, relationships, and trust. This ties back to this extensive interactions. That essentially, it's a lot easier usually to be in a group with somebody you've been in a group with before than it is to just sort of have to do a group project with a bunch of strangers. Because now you know what to expect, what to look out for, and you can solve some of these problems ahead of time. There is an element of trust. If I don't clean the bathroom and I say, look, I'm going to clean it, don't worry. If I've been pretty trustworthy up till now, you may let it slide. It may make it easier for us to get some cooperation on this. And then, of course, ethics, religion, duty, shame, eternal reward, good feelings. All these things can also sort of play a role in in how, for example, how we monitor, what kind of punishments are considered good punishments, and the credibility of those things. All right, so that's solution number 3, voluntary community consent. A lot of what we're going to work on in here, I want you to think about from this perspective, especially that community monitoring and credible punishment for your project. It's not going to apply to every project, but I'd like you to start there and think about that. And then we'll think about the other things if this is not really a viable way of doing it. This is where a lot of global governance happens right here. Solution number 4, this is another place where a lot of global governance happens, and that is to help people understand what is really in their own interest. This is much more that constructivist version, constructivist model. And what we mean here is simply to change people's preferences. So for example, things like education. The more you sort of know about climate change, perhaps the more you're willing to contribute to the public good of reduction of greenhouse gases. Another would be media campaigns. This is a lot of what NGOs do. NGOs do this a lot. They invest in movies and in press releases and in getting stories and interviews and things like that to get out there so that you who are not really contributing to, say, the stopping of child soldiers, you may say, this is something that I really need to be concerned about. Or me who's driving a SUV around, that maybe the more education, the more media campaigns, the more I might be convinced that I should really be conserving the amount of greenhouse gases I'm using by driving to work than if I'm not. I'll give you a good example. This last time I taught global governance, we were talking about straws. One of the environmental sciences majors, and we were talking about straws and sort of the plastic versus the metal straws. And I got to be honest with you, I was just going, plastic straws. Like I don't use straws anyways, but plastic straws, is that really going to change the world? But by the end of the class, she had pretty much convinced us all that metal straws was the way to go. It was not so much that she punished us or she did community monitoring or any of those other things. She just essentially educated us in, her own little version of a media campaign. And, I have a metal straw now. And that's just sort of the way that goes. One last thing I want to leave you on this topic, and this is going to sound cynical, and I don't mean it to sound cynical, but maybe I guess it is. And sometimes we use the word propaganda. Propaganda has a negative connotation to it. And all I want to say about this is the key is that people believe that the action is in their interest, not that the action actually is in their interest. I know that sounds cynical. I know that sounds almost dishonest, But if you want people to, say, for example, not traffic human beings anymore, it may be that human trafficking is in that individual's interest. But you want them to believe that human trafficking is not in their interest, even if it is. Does that make sense? So I don't want you to think about this from a dishonesty standpoint, though that can actually play a role in this sometimes. I want you to think about this in the terms of, even if it's in their interest, you don't want them to behave that particular way anymore. How can you convince them to change their behavior? Okay, I'm gonna stop here for a second. I got one more thing I want to talk about, that's institutionalization, but I'm just gonna take a break and then come back with another video.